Grim morning and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristin. Today we're unlatching the rusted gate and slipping quietly into Père Lachaise, an acropolis not merely of stone but of legend. Here beneath Parisian skies and crumbling angels, the dead rest uneasily in marble rows, their names etched in shadow and song. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air. The gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. In the heart of the Parisian city of light, Père Lachaise lingers in its long shadows, its rusting gates seducing over 3.5 million souls a year. Paris, in my opinion, wears its decay like a perfume, a scent both old and dirty, yet irresistibly charming. Fittingly, the city's most iconic cemetery mirrors those very qualities. Its grounds are an ode to death, where every plant and lament are tailored to grief. To call it a cemetery feels almost dismissive. It's truly a cathedral of the dead, and if I'm being honest, it's a quiet wonder of the world, cloaked in moss and a testament to the forgotten. For Père Lachaise, its history is as layered and unapologetically Parisian as the city of Paris itself. Before it became an necropolis of the famous and forgotten, the land belonged to a wealthy 15th century merchant known as Champlevet. By the 17th century, the Jesuits had claimed the hilltop estate long after his death, transforming it into a secluded retreat. It was here Father Francois, known more familiarly as the Père Lachaise, confessor to King Louis XIV, took up residence. The cemetery bears his name, though he likely never imagined it would one day become a sanctuary for the dead. The Jesuits, ever loyal to their monarch, renamed the area Mont Louis in honor of the king. Louis himself is said to have visited during times of unrest, including the Fronde, a series of civil wars in France between 1648 and 1653. He was also accompanied by his bodyguards, who kept a residence nearby on the property. This meant that lavish parties followed, though not just for pleasure, but as performances, eager spectacles for those hoping to secure the king's favor, or perhaps that of his confessor. After Père Lachaise's death in 1709, the estate expanded. But like all things too closely tied to power, the Jesuits eventually fell out of favor. By the 1760s, they were expelled from France, the property seized, and the land left to sleep for a time, until the dead began to arrive. By the close of the 18th century, though, Paris was teetering on the edge of rot. The dead had begun to overrun the city. Burial grounds spilled over, churchyards soured the air, and the fears of miasma, the poisonous breath of decay, grew louder with each passing season. Death, once tucked neatly behind chapel doors, had become a public crisis, and something had to be done. And so in 1804, under Napoleon's order, the city established a grand multi-episcopal cemetery on the eastern outskirts, a place of distance, air, and order. The land that had once hosted royal confidants and Jesuit retreats would now serve the dead on a far greater scale. The layout was entrusted to architect Alexandre-Théodore Brongniart, whose design evoked the regal splendor of classical gardens, and was further shaped by Nicolas Frochot, the urban planner who understood that even the dead could benefit from a good publicity campaign. At first, the location, however, worked against them. Père Lachaise was too far, too unfamiliar, and too new. It wasn't in the fashionable center of Paris, it was beyond it. Many Roman Catholics were also hesitant to be buried in a cemetery that hadn't been consecrated by the church. As a result, Père Lachaise stood mostly empty in its earliest years. But Faucheux was clever. To elevate the cemetery's allure, he orchestrated a performance of the dead, reinterring the remains of cultural titans like Molière and La Fontaine with great ceremony, transferring them from forgotten churchyards to the sloping tree-lined avenues of Père Lachaise. It was a spectacle and Paris watched. Even writers took note. Balzac, one of France's literary greats ever attuned to death, desire, and decay, began threading the cemetery into his fiction, transforming its stones into symbols, though the cemetery was never directly mentioned. Through his prose, Père Lachaise found a second life, and in doing so drew the living ever closer to the dead. And it worked. The curious came, the grieving followed, and soon the wealthy arrived with their architects and their marble dreams. To be buried at Père Lachaise became a final performance of status, a tomb that spoke just not of how one died, but how one lived. The tombs began to rise, elaborate, towering, mournful creations, miniature cathedrals, and sculpted sorrows, each one competing for attention and mortality. By the late 19th century, even the rituals of fire had arrived. A crematorium was built, adding flame to a place already steeped in stone. What had begun as a practical solution became something else entirely, a theater of memory, a monument to mortality, and for many a final performance beneath the Parisian sky. And speaking of final performances, no grave of Pierre Lachaise draws the living, quite like the resting place of Jim Morrison, a man infamous for losing himself on stage and dragging audiences with him into the abyss. Tucked among the tombs of poets and revolutionaries, Morrison's grave, once unmarked and nearly forgotten, has become a shrine for the strange. Like the man himself, it refuses to fade quietly. It haunts the cemetery's winding paths, exhaling myths and murmurs of the American specter buried beneath the Parisian soil. Born in Florida on December 8th, 1943, he would become a prophet of chaos, singer, poet, fire starter, etched forever in the mythology of American rock. With a baritone voice soaked in velvet and venom, he conjured incantations masked as songs. The end, riders of the storm, when the music's over. Each one cast a spell across the airways of the damned as the frontman of the Doors. He claimed his soul was pierced as a child on a desert highway, where bloody spirits of Native American men leapt from the wreckage of a car crash and slipped into him. Whether an actual memory or a myth, it became Morrison's story and his own haunting. In 1965, he formed the Doors with keyboardist Ray Manzarek in the sun-drenched bohemia of Venice Beach. They opened a gate into the world of rock and roll, and something darker stepped through. With Light My Fire, the world ignited, throwing them from the shadows into the limelight. With each performance, though, Morrison unraveled. Drunken, divine, and dangerous, a Dionysus on stage, a ghost in waiting. By the late 1960s, his voice became a literature for the lost. He read poetry into the microphones like they were altars. He was arrested for obscenity, censored for daring too much, but he still prowled across the stage, leather clad and half possessed, as if each show might be his last sermon. In 1971, he vanished to Paris. Here with his muse in torment, Pamela caressed him, they wandered the labyrinthian streets, chasing silence and ghosts. On July 3rd, Morrison's body was found in a bathtub. No autopsy, no certainty, just silence. He was only 27. For years, Jim Morrison's graves at Père Lachaise stood unmarked, anonymous in the City of Lights, a simple plot, no name, no monument. Only whispers and conspiracy theories of the mythical man. French officials eventually placed a modest shield over this site, but even that was stolen in 1973. In the cemetery's directory, he was misfiled under a name not quite his own, Douglas James Morrison, as if even in death his identity refused to be nailed down. In 1981, a Croatian sculptor named Milan Mikolan, moved by Morrison's myth, created a marble bust and a new gravestone to honor the 10th anniversary of his death. For a time, the ghost had a face, but the Vandals came, and like so many of Morrison's memories, the bust was defaced. Then stolen entirely in 1988, McCullen would craft another in 1989, and later a bronze death mask in 2001, though neither remains at the gravesite. Decades later, in May of 2025, the original sculpture resurfaced, unexpectedly recovered by the Parisian police during an unrelated investigation, the sculpture becoming almost as enigmatic and puzzling as the man himself. In 1990, his father placed a final marker on the grave, a flat stone bearing a cryptic Greek epitaph stating, true to his own spirit, or perhaps more chillingly, according to his own demon. And perhaps Morrison was. He left behind 6 albums, a trail of whispered poems, and a conspiracy and a myth that refuses to die within Père Lachaise. In its earliest years, the cemetery's gates opened not only to the dead, but to a love story that would be carved into its foundation. It's a story tangled in philosophy, ink, and blood. Fittingly Parisian within is a tomb that holds not just bodies, but letters, laments, and a love that outlived flesh. Here encased in stone and sorrow are the bones of Peter Abelard and Heloise, two minds set ablaze by thought and desire, bound together in history by passion, punishment, and ink stained confessions. He was the mind of his age, a philosopher, scholar, and heretic of holy text. Peter Abelard taught beneath the cloisters of Notre Dame, his thoughts sharp as blades, his tongue gilded with rhetoric. She was the niece of Canon Filbert, young Heloise, a luminous and learned woman in a world that punished such brilliance. Fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, she outshone her peers, a candle burning too bright. Their meeting was no accident. Abelard offered to tutor Heloise, and Filbert, eager for his niece's advancement, welcomes the arrangement. But Abelard's lessons quickly turned into longing. Beneath the guide of pedagogy, he seduced her, and she, too clever not to see, chose to be seduced. The scholar and his pupil became lovers, reckless and radiant. When Filbert learned the truth, rage shattered the illusion. He separated them, but couldn't sever the bond. Heloise had become pregnant and fled to Brittany to give birth to their son, Astrolabe, a child of stars and scandal. A secret marriage followed, urged by Abelard to protect his standing, but was resisted by Heloise, who feared it would diminish his greatness. Yet she didn't want to just be his wife, she wanted to be his equal. Still, she eventually relented, and like all things between them, the union was both tender and tragic. Then came the night of blood. Enraged, Heloise's uncle Filbert sought revenge, and the dead of night while Abelard slept, Filbert's men crept inside their home. Her father, however, didn't choose murder. He chose something far darker, something more horrific. Mutilating Abelard, they castrated him, stripping him of his manhood, and condemning him to a lifetime of shame and ruin. In an era already darkened by medieval cruelty, the axe still managed to shock Christendom as news spread of Filbert's revenge. Heloise then was sent to a convent to live out her days in silence, and Abelard entered a monastery, their bodies separated, but their minds, their voices, their longing remained entangled. What followed was a series of letters unlike anything else from the Middle Ages. The surviving correspondence is a tapestry of agony, intellect, love, and theology, giving historians insight into a side of medieval life not normally found. Heloise wrote not just as a lover, but as a philosopher, a feminist before the word had even formed. She challenged the sanctity of marriage, questioned divine justice, and refused to let her desire be rewritten as sin. You know, my beloved, she wrote to him, as the world knows now how much I have lost in you, and how my sorrow for my loss is nothing compared to what I feel for the manner in which I lost you. Now, centuries later, their effigies lie side by side at Père Lachaise, hands nearly touching, lips sealed forever. Though the cemetery now shelters them in solemn stillness, their bones have wandered nearly as much as their souls. Abelard spent his final days not in Paris, but in quiet exile at the Priory of Saint Martial. It was here in April of 1142 that he passed away, a scholar turned monk, a man once consumed by philosophy and passion, now resigned to contemplation and ash. Not long after, Peter the Venerable, friend, abbot, and final witness, penned a letter to Heloise. In it, he described Abelard's passing with a gentleness not often afforded to heretics. God now unfolds him in his embrace in place of you, as another you, and he keeps him here for you until the trumpets sound, until the Lord descends, and through his grace he is restored to you again. But Peter did more than just write. In secret and with trembling purpose, he ordered Abelard's remains exhumed from St. Martial. Personally and reverently, he carried them to Paraclete, the very abbey where Heloise was abbess, so he might lie beneath the same roof, if only even in death. He assured those that would ask that Abelard had been absolved, cleansed of heresy, and that the specter of the theological scandal wouldn't desecrate his grave. Later, Heloise would be laid beside him, their two bodies, once torn apart by violence, now reunited in stillness beneath the chapel stone. But their rest was far from eternal. Over the centuries, the remains were disturbed, reburied, lifted again and again. The abbey grew in importance, and with each passing age, their tomb grew more elaborate. In 1779, what was supposed to be their final resting place at Père Lachaise was built anew, only to be destroyed in the chaos of revolution. Their bones were exhumed once more, this time carried to a small parish church. Then in 1800, André Lenoir, a painter and visionary with a taste for ruins and resurrection, acquired what remained of the couple. He placed them on his display in his Museum des Monuments Francois, where scholars measured their skulls, cataloged their bones, and whispered of love, theology, and scandal. But Lenore had grander plans. In 1802, he had reconstructed a tomb using fractured relics of their past, a preserved effigy of Abelard from St. Martial, and a headless 14th century sculpture he transformed into Heloise by giving it a new face. Around them he arranged spolia, carved stone from Metz, Saint Germain des Prés, and the wreckage of belief and empire. A neo Gothic chapel rose around them like a cathedral of ghosts and splendor. Stained glass windows were imagined but never installed. Still, the tomb stood, haunting, beautiful, and strangely whole. A monument not only to two lovers, but to every aching heart that ever longed for a forever. In 1817, the tomb was moved one final time to its current home in Père Lachaise. In the 19th century, this monument became a gathering place for the broken-hearted, a shrine where lovers cast letters like spells and mourners left flowers like prayers. But perhaps in our modern hour, such places no longer cradle unrequited love. Perhaps all that remains are the embers of regret, divorces filed, silences grown too wide to cross. What once burned now barely flickers. But the legend of love is enough. To hear their story becomes a spell, cast generation after generation across the aching earth. Because in the end, it's not only Heloise and Abelard who lie here. It's every soul who ever loved beyond the boundaries of what was allowed. No longer condemned, no longer alone. Perhaps it's not their bodies beneath the stone, but their legend of love that binds them in eternity. After a spellbinding tale of forbidden medieval love, how else could Père Lachaise seduce the soul? With the melody of love itself, the voice of France, Edith Piaf. Mournful, longing, ever in love, ever in Paris. Her voice still drifts among the tombs. It echoes across stone and shadow, never silent, never gone. Edith Giovanni Guesson was known to the world as Edith Piaf. Was more than a singer. She was the sound of Paris breathing through heartbreak. She reigned over the cabarets and shadowed music halls with a voice that could cradle you or cut you, often in the same breath. Paris was still shaking from war, and Edith came into the world not with lullabies, but with the echoes of loss. Her mother, a street singer of Italian and Kabyle descent, abandoned her at birth. Her father, a circus acrobat, enlisted in the French army soon after, leaving Edith to be raised among strangers and shadows. She spent her earliest years not in warmth, but in a brothel run by her grandmother in Normandy. Here among the courtesans and candle smoke, the child was passed from hand to hand, watched over by the women of the night. When Edith fell ill, keratitis stole her sight for nearly 4 years. It was these women, with what little they had, who pulled their coins and faith to send her on a pilgrimage to St. Therese of Lisieux. And whether by miracle or memory, the child's vision returned. Paith would later call it divine grace. Others might say she simply saw too much of the world too soon. From age 14, she was singing on the streets beside her father, performing while he tumbled and bowed. By 15, she was on her own, surviving by song and cigarette smoke. Her voice, raw, cracked, real, was impossible to ignore. Paris itself seemed to hush when she sang. One night, fate stepped out of the fog in the form of Louis Lepley, a cabaret owner and talent scout with a flair for misfits and melancholy. I found her on the Montmartre sidewalk singing to survive, and he knew at once. This girl wasn't just good, she was a legend waiting to be written. He took her in, gave her a stage, gave her a name. La Momie Piath, the little sparrow. Small, fragile, and untamed, he taught her how to perform, how to channel every scar and sorrow into song. He dressed her in a simple black dress that would become her uniform, her armor, her shroud. But Paris, ever the fickle lover, turned quickly. In 1936, Louis Lepli was murdered. The press circled like vultures, feeding on whispers that tied Piaf to the mobsters who killed him. She was questioned, humiliated, and nearly blacklisted. The city that had applauded her now turned its gaze away. To survive, she had to be reborn again. She shed the street girl image and took back her full name, E.F. Piaf. Under the guidance of lyricist Raymond Asso and composer Marguerite Monod, she found her voice anew. They crafted songs that weren't just music but memoirs. Love, loss, longing, and each lyric a confession pulled from the bloodstream. And Paris listened. The Sparrow had been something more than a singer. She was a vessel for every broken heart. She became the soundtrack of the city's pain, its passion, its post war hunger for beauty and truth. She simply wasn't just performing, she was bleeding on stage, and the crowd couldn't look away. The war came like a slow eclipse over Paris. By 1940, the city was occupied, and the cabarets flickered like candles in a storm. But Edith Piaf kept singing. Some called it courage, others compromise. She performed in nightclubs, in brothels, and in private salons where German officers drank champagne and asked for encores. She entertained the enemy, they said. She kept the lights on while others were extinguished. And for a time, the question of whether she was a collaborator or simply a survivor hung over her like smoke. But the truth, like most legends, is murky. She did travel to Berlin in 1943, invited to perform for French prisoners of war. Piaf posed for photographs with them, smiling and theatrical, then returned to Paris. Yet those same photos would later be used to forge false documents, helping several of the men escape. Her secretary, a member of the resistance, later testified that Piaf smuggled aid into camps and used her fame to move through occupied France like a phantom. She lived in a bordello steps away from Gestapo headquarters. She sang love songs beneath Nazi banners. But perhaps her greatest act of resistance was not in what she said, but in what she never stopped doing. Giving voice to longing, to freedom, to the ache of a world that refused to be silenced. By 1944, as the Allies approached, Piaf stood on the stage in the Moulin Rouge, a new lover by her side, actor and singer Yves Mondan. She was no longer a street singer or a cabaret girl. She was the soul of Paris, tarnished, tired, but unbroken. When liberation came, some sought to punish her. She was summoned to testify, accused of collaborating, but the charges never stuck. Perhaps it was her charm, perhaps it was the truth. Perhaps it was because Paris couldn't bear itself to exile the voice that had become its own. And so she sang on. In 1945, when the war ended, she wrote what would become her most iconic anthem, La Vida Rosa, a hymn of aching hope, a love song for a city trying to believe in beauty again. Like a spell, the world felt deeply for the song that would define her. From the cafes of Montmartre to the dance halls of Manhattan, Piaf would become a symbol of resistance, of romance, and of something real in an increasingly artificial world. She sang of love but rarely had her own peace. Her personal life unraveled beneath the weight of grief. In 1949, the love of her life, boxing champion Marcel Cerdan, boarded a plane to New York to be with her, but it never arrived. The aircraft crashed into a mountain in the Azores, and him with it. Piaf, shattered, wrote Hymn à l'amour, in wake of his death, a song for his ghost that haunted her. And yet she continued to climb. She toured America, performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, and filled concert halls across Europe and South America. Her voice, though cracked with pain, held power. Every note was a wound reopened, and the world couldn't get enough. But fame has its hunger. A car crash in 1951 shattered more than bones in Piaf, pulling her into a spiral of morphine, brandy, sleepless nights, and phantom pain. More crashes followed, with more pills and more men. She married twice after her accident, once to singer Jaco Pills, and then to Theo Sarapo, a Greek hairdresser 20 years her junior. Love for Piaf was both refuge and ruin. By 1963, Piaf found she was dying of cancer. She weighed less than 70 pounds, and yet in April of that year she recorded one final song. On October 10th, 1963, she slipped away in her villa on the French Riviera, surrounded by shadows and morphine, her body ravaged by cancer and years of sorrow. She was just 47. Though she had lived twice that, burning twice as bright, her husband Theo Serapo secretly transported her body back to Paris so the city would believe she died at home, among its spires and cobblestones. Her funeral procession, though, brought Paris to a standstill. More than 100,000 mourners flooded the streets. People wept openly, clutched records to their chests, and whispered lyrics like prayers. It was the only time the city had come to a full stop since the liberation. The Catholic Church, though, denied her a proper requiem mass. She had lived too wildly, married after divorce, sung in brothels, and loved without apology. But the people gave her a funeral of saints. In 2013, 50 years after her death, the church reversed its judgment and held a requiem in the very parish she was born. By then, of course, she had already become a myth. Her resting place is a simple black marble slab in Père Lachaise, where she lies alongside fellow artists and thinkers. Inscribed with her name is that of her husband, Theo Serapo, and the phrase, "Love conquers all." Her grave is a quiet tribute. Yet the steady stream of visitors who leave roses, light cigarettes, and write song lyrics on nearby stones shows that her voice, a timeless part of Paris's soul, continues to resonate far beyond the cemetery's walls. Standing within Père Lachaise, we move on next to a man who built the literary necropolis and is now a permanent resident of a real one. Every ghost has an origin, and for Honoré de Balzac, the haunting began in his own cradle. Born into a home built on the cold foundation of ambition and a loveless marriage, he was a child abandoned by warmth, sent away at birth, and kept at a chilling distance upon his return. His only affection came from books devoured in the school's solitude punishment cell they called the alcove, where he inhaled the world and forged the tools to dissect every soul he would ever meet. The city of Paris called him back, but the legal career his father envisioned felt like a death sentence. To Balzac, the wall was a theater of ghouls, a catalogue of greed, betrayal, and bitter inheritance. He fled to a garret, choosing starvation over a spiritual lie. From this rot, a monstrous ambition was born. He would perform a literary autopsy on an entire nation. He called it La Comédie Humaine, a city of paper and ink populated by the living, the dying, and the damned. His work became a nightly ritual, a kind of dark magic filled by rivers of black coffee. He became a ghost in his own life, a specter wrestling souls onto the page, bleeding his own betrayals and debts into his characters until the line between creator and creation blurred. A desperate consuming love bloomed on the edge of the grave with Helena Hanska, a countess who pursued him through letters for 15 years. He married his dream just months before the ink ran dry for good. Balzac died in 1850, consumed not by sickness, but by his own creation. At his funeral, Victor Hugo declared, "A nation is in mourning for a man of genius." And so he lies within Père Lachaise, his monument by Rodin leaning forward as if still straining to write one more line. But a man like Balzac is never truly silent. He isn't buried here, he's planted. His ghost walks off his pages and into our world. Honoré de Balzac did not merely write about the human soul, he exhumed it. He pinned its withering form to the page and dared it to look back at us from the abyss. Next, we approach his soul born beneath the crumbling pillars of revolution, a child of uncertain lineage, of whispered scandals and rising empires. Eugene Delacroix came into the world in April 1798 under the heavy breath of history, carrying the restless spirit of Romanticism before it even had a name. His mother was a descendant from artisans, but his father's identity was a matter of state intrigue. It was claimed the true blood in his veins belonged to Talleyrand, that limping architect of French diplomacy. Whether by blood or by favor, Talleyrand's shadow would follow Delacroix, opening doors in palaces and salons. But he was never content to sit beneath chandeliers. He painted like a man possessed, a revolutionary in vision, if not in politics. While his rival Ingres chased symmetry and order, Delacroix reached for chaos, for riot, rupture, and color that bled and screamed. He found truth not in polished myths, but in blood-soaked soil, in storm-ridden shores, and in Shakespeare's ghosts and Byron's doomed heroes. His brushstrokes gave expression to a caged soul, and at the salon his paintings shocked society. The Barquet of Dante, the massacre at Chios, the death of Paulus. The critics deemed them too wild, too sensual, too full of death. Yet what they called vulgar, the people called real. Delacroix's art was history as a raw wound, dripping with consequence. His masterpiece, Liberty Leading the People, proved the most dangerous of all. A woman crowned in tricolor, she stepped over the dead with a musket in her hand. She wasn't a goddess, but a ghost of hope rising from the smoke. A truth so potent that the government bought the painting only to hide it away. Delacroix didn't chase utopia, but pure emotion, despair, longing, rage, ecstasy. His travels to Morocco and Algeria gave him what he called living antiquity, cities and people untouched by the Enlightenment. He returned to Paris transformed, filling his journals with their light and chaos. He worked feverishly, sometimes 15 hours without pause, feeding on coffee and solitude until his body gave out. When death came in August of 1863, it was quiet. He left simple orders: no death mask, no likeness. Let the work speak, let the body disappear. But Delacroix never disappeared. After his death, he remains one of the greatest painters of our time, entombed fittingly among the same society that once branded him vulgar. His grave is modest, but his paintings are masterpieces that live on. They continue to inspire awe, shock, and intrigue in visitors, forever remembering a man who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. Père Lachaise always has a way of revealing itself anew with every visit. No matter how long you linger, its beauty, often called unparalleled, never fails to inspire a sense of awe. It's clear how this cemetery influenced the design of many others, from London's Magnificent Seven to Bonaventure and countless others, proving its power and beauty extend far beyond its famous names buried within its walls. Père Lachaise may be a place of pilgrimage and beauty, but do not be mistaken. These are not entirely peaceful grounds. The city of stone has its own scarred history, its own ghosts of war, and its soil has been soaked in blood more than once. The silence here is deceptive, for these avenues have twice echoed with the sounds of battle. In 1814, during the final days of the Napoleonic Wars, Russian soldiers stormed over the tombstones in a desperate fight for Paris. But a far darker memory is etched into its eastern wall. In the final bloodied week of the Paris Commune in 1871, the cemetery became the last stronghold for the revolutionaries. Here, among the graves of their ancestors, 147 communards were cornered, lined up against the wall, and slaughtered by government troops, their bodies thrown into an open pit. This unquiet ground, haunted by the specters of a forgotten civil war. Beyond the violence enacted within its walls, the cemetery also stands as a solemn witness to the horrors of the wider world. Three memorials bear the weight of the First World War, while monuments to the victims of the Holocaust rise like stark warnings from the earth, memorializing those deported to concentration camps from which they never returned. This place is not just a collection of personal sorrows, but a landscape of collective human tragedy, where different faiths, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, find a common home for their grief. Every style of funerary art is represented in this empire of death, forming a ghostly architectural timeline. Skeleton Gothic spires clothe the sky, grand Haussmannian burial chambers stand like cold, miniature mansions for the elite dead, and ancient mausoleums brood like forgotten pagan temples. Every tomb is a story, every path is a journey through a history written not in ink, but in stone, sorrow, and blood. It's easy to mistake the silence for this place for peace and solidarity. Yet some of its residents are notoriously restless, and visitors are truly never alone. They say that the ghost of Jim Morrison still lingers here, a smoke like figure captured in a chilling photograph, unable to leave the site of his pilgrimage. Other hauntings are more insidious, burrowing not into your ears but into your mind. Then there are places where the sorrow is too immense for a single ghost, like the Communard's Wall, a scar in the earth that radiates a cold despair from the mass grave of 147 slaughtered revolutionaries. To walk these paths is to feel watched, to hear whispers on the wind, and to understand that this is not a place of rest, but an unquiet city where the dead are not entirely forgotten or gone. Père Lachaise is far from a static museum of the dead. It remains an active cemetery with a long waiting list for its coveted plots. To be eligible for burial, one must have either lived or died in Paris, and even then, plots are often temporarily leased. If a family's concession expires, the remains can be exhumed and moved to the cemetery's ossuary to make room for new residents. Amidst the graves, the cemetery functions as an unofficial nature preserve and one of Paris's most vital green spaces, with over 5,000 trees providing sanctuary for birds, lizards, and even foxes that live among the tombs. As the wrought iron gates of Pere Lachaise groan shut behind us, the stories slip back into stone, and the dead return to their uneasy rest. But they're never quiet for long. Pere Lachaise has more resonance that will lead us to return soon on the Grim. Thank you for joining us as we crossed over the veil into Pere Lachaise, descending into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil drawn, but death keeps no calendar. We'll return, as we always do, on the Grim.